Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, episode 72 The Siege of Toulon. In the last episode, we saw the occupation of Toulon. Desperate to avoid the return of the Jacobins, Toulon chose treason and allied with the enemy. In this episode, we will see blunder after blunder. From the selfish priorities of the First Coalition to the incompetence of multiple French leaders, the opening weeks of their campaign were a lesson in what not to do. Well, with one exception. For in this episode, we will also meet a future emperor of the French. But before we get into it, a gigantic thank you to those heroic revolutionaries who are keeping Grey History on the air. This campaign, this revolution, is only possible thanks to the amazing members of the Grey History community. If you find Grey History entertaining, if you find it educational, then I need your support to ensure that there's more Grey History waiting for you tomorrow. By donating the equivalent of just half a cup of coffee when main narrative episodes are released, you can indulge in hours of bonus content, ad-free listening, and a range of other perks. Furthermore, those donating a full cup of coffee already have early access to episode 73, Napoleon's Triumph. That amazing episode also has 3 episode extras, the equivalent of a full bonus episode, waiting for you right now. So, don't wait, help produce history that isn't black and white, and join the community today. There's links in the show notes and on the website, and those listeners on Apple Podcasts have a subscription option within the app. Of course, I can't start a new episode without making some introductions to the newest, awesomest people on the planet. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizens, Gregory, Duncan, Thomas, Melinda, Nathan, Luke, Kenneth, and Will. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, Justin, Andre, and an anonymous citizen who goes by the alias Quiet Yuzu Cake. I would also like to thank Robbie for increasing their pledge and joining the True Revolutionaries. Speaking of increased support, a huge shout out to Britt, who joins the amazing Champions of the People. All revolutions need their champions, so thank you to Cindy, George, Mark, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Kevin, Carl, Jeff, Ritas, Hannah, Tyrone, Jen, Cameron, and now Britt. Finally, there's the Pantheon of Greats, the heroes of the revolution, who have now been joined by Ron. Thank you to Ron for increasing your support of the show, and you're in great company with the tremendously generous heroes of the revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin, Scott, Howard, Fernando, and Hilberto. As always, thank you to all the amazing people keeping Grey History on the air, and a special thank you to those people who have been helping in some other way, like sharing the show with friends and family, promoting the show on social media and Reddit, leaving reviews, or sending in one-off donations. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into the Siege of Toulon. It seems of no use to send a great fleet without troops to act with them. So wrote Captain Horatio Nelson in August 1793. Although writing days before Toulon's surrender, Nelson had encapsulated the central problem which would come to haunt the Allies. Having seized the great arsenal of Toulon, how were they going to keep it? By early September, the Anglo-Spanish defence lacked 2 critical resources: time and men. Soon outnumbered 3 to 1, the Allied powers needed immediate support. Unless aid was forthcoming, Toulon would fall. Yet, when Vice Admiral Hood had first occupied the town, the commander had made a simple bet. With almost all of Europe in league against France, surely aid would arrive. As it turns out, Hood's optimism was misplaced. Far from a deluge of men and supplies, what Hood encountered was division, self-interest, and a hefty dose of ineptitude. Across the continent's capitals, the fractured coalition would soon doom the defence. Consequently, before we can witness Napoleon's triumph, we must first appreciate the failures of his enemies. If we take a step back and examine a map of Europe, there were a number of places in which support could theoretically be found. So numerous, in fact, that it's understandable why Hood believed assistance would be forthcoming. For starters, there's the three great powers that underpinned the First Coalition: Austria, Prussia, and of course, Hood's homeland of Great Britain. Additionally, various local powers could aid Toulon, including Spain, Piedmont Sardinia, and Naples. Finally, assistance from unexpected corners might be possible. Some desired, others less so. To commence our search for Toulon's would-be defenders, let's check in with the great Germanic powers. If we start with Prussia, it's reasonable to suggest that Toulon simply wasn't Berlin's problem. After all, the Mediterranean was a long way away. Now, this may be true, but you know what was Berlin's problem? The Rhineland. And you know what the Prussians were focused on? Yes, that's right, Poland. By September 1793, as Toulon desperately called for aid, Prussia was focused on the east. Redirecting troops from the Western Front against France, Prussian resources were pouring into the newly annexed territories. This was an issue. Not only was one of the great powers diverting its attention when France was at its most vulnerable, but the departing Prussian troops forced allies to plug the gaps. Thus, while Prussia was never likely to support Toulon directly, its fixation on eastern expansion was hampering Allied efforts. But if the Prussians were prioritizing their territorial ambitions, what about the Austrians? Surely they wouldn't be doing the same. Well, while Vienna was also far from Toulon, Emperor Francis II had multiple reasons to engage in the Mediterranean campaign. Firstly, Austrian forces were already involved in the Italian theatre, with the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia losing the Duchy of Savoy and the County of Nice in 1792. Austrian troops had rushed to assist their faltering ally. By the time of Toulon's occupation, Austrian officers were staffing key positions in the Piedmontese army. Furthermore, combined forces held the vital passes across the Western Alps, preventing French entry into Piedmont and thus northern Italy more broadly. Now, that last part is key. Although protecting an ally, the Austrians weren't doing so merely for the benefit of Piedmont Sardinia. In defending the Alpine passes, the Austrians were simultaneously protecting their own Italian territories. At this point in time, Austria controlled the Duchy of Milan and the nearby city of Mantua. These interests were valuable assets in the Habsburg domains. Thus, in addition to the troops defending Piedmont, Austria had also stationed thousands of troops in northern Italy. Troops which could be diverted to Toulon. After all, the French presented no threat if contained on the other side of the Alps, so why not deploy these forces somewhere where they could actually be of use? Vienna recognized this, and in late September, the Austrians promised to send 5,000 soldiers from Milan. For Vice Admiral Hood, this was a dream come true. To appreciate the significance of this support, It's worth noting just how few troops the Anglo-Spanish defenders had at their disposal. When Toulon was first occupied in late August, the British had as few as 1,600 soldiers. This pitiful force wasn't even experienced Marines, but rather a mixture of detachments of soldiers borrowed from the army. Attached to the navy, these soldiers were not equipped for extended operations on land. Furthermore, they also lacked field-grade officers, such as majors and colonels. This is why Nelson lamented that the fleet had been deployed without sufficient troops. Joining the British were the Spanish, whose Marines weren't that much greater in number. Spanish soldiers would arrive within days, quickly taking the Spanish force of both soldiers and Marines to approximately 4,000. Thus, once you add the questionable support of Toulon's French royalists, you're looking at a combined figure of perhaps 7,000 men in early September. So inadequate was this force that in times of desperation, both fleets would frantically send sailors ashore to plug the gaps in Toulon's defences. Consequently, 5,000 Austrian troops, properly trained, properly led, well, that was almost a miracle. More than triple the number of British soldiers currently on the ground, their presence would be nothing short of a godsend. But it's here that Hood's dreams turned into a mirage. Having bemoaned the selfish behaviour of the Prussians, it was now the turn of the Austrians to focus on territorial expansion and contribute to the coalition of dysfunction. This time, disputes would arise between the Austrians and the Piedmontese. In 1793, Piedmont Sardinia was desperate to recover its western territories which had been annexed by the French. Too small to do so alone, Austria spotted an opportunity. Back in the 1730s, Piedmont had annexed a slither of territory surrounding Novara in northern Italy, just to the west of Milan. These lands had been Austrian territory. As it turns out, Vienna had a long memory. Fast forward the clock, and come 1793, the Austrians adopted the Prussian playbook of aggressive negotiation. Like the Prussians, who demanded immediate compensation in Poland as a precondition for continued cooperation against France, Austria would now capitalize on the desperation of its Italian ally. In return for assistance in reclaiming Savoy and Nice, Austria sought the immediate return of some of its previous territories. Copying the Prussians further, Piedmont was given the vague promise of future compensation at the expense of France, yet only once the war was won. To put it plainly, Turin said no. Facing opposition, Austria proceeded to pressure Piedmont Sardinia and its ally, Great Britain. It did this by stalling the deployment of its Milanese troops to Toulon. British officials tore their hair out as they tried to break the unanticipated deadlock. One British diplomat complained of delays, excuses, fine equivocal words, and ambiguous promises. Eventually, Vienna relented. But by the time it did so, it was already too late. So, thus far, the two great powers of Austria and Prussia had been less than ideal allies in Hood's desperate search for troops. With both nations focused on their own interests, significant opportunities were lost. However, Hood still had options, including Britain's Mediterranean allies, Spain, Naples, and Piedmont Sardinia. If we start with Spain, the Spanish contribution to the defence was always significant in terms of its proportion. On the 28th of August, the Spanish fleet had arrived in Toulon under the command of Don Juan de Langara. Although Langara had not been dispatched from Madrid, Langara had answered Hood's calls for assistance, anticipating that Toulon could fall into Allied hands. Before departing Spain, Langara had sent for support himself, meaning that by early September, the Spanish had perhaps as many as 4,000 soldiers and marines. This was a significant benefit to Hood, whose own soldiers were substantially less. But it's here that the good news came to an end. With the French fleet now in Allied hands, the Spanish could have ferried troops to Toulon with ease. This is precisely what Langara sought, arguing that events in Provence, that is to say, southeastern France, could decisively end the war. However, Spain, like everyone else, had other priorities. Since April 1793, a Spanish army had been operating in southwest France, on the Mediterranean side of the Franco-Spanish border. General Ricardos, leading the Spanish across the Pyrenees, thought it wiser to maintain his army's resources than divert them to Toulon. Madrid agreed. As such, while further support was forthcoming, it was hardly the full potential of the Spanish army. By the end of the siege, the Spanish force would total about 7,000, in addition to the Spanish fleet. So, Toulon had found some assistance, but not as much as either Hood or Langara would have liked. A smaller force of potential soldiers was the Kingdom of Naples. Naples had signed a treaty with Great Britain in July 1793, and, in a pleasant change of pace, the Neapolitans intended to do their part. Arriving in multiple contingents, by the end of the campaign, roughly 6,000 soldiers had arrived in Toulon. Finally, you have the other Italian kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia. Having signed a treaty with Great Britain in April 1793, Vice Admiral Hood had anticipated significant support from Turin. Not only had Piedmont pledged the maintenance of 50,000 men, but the kingdom was practically next door. Lying just on the other side of the Alps, Turin was perhaps the best chance for both immediate and consequential reinforcement. But Piedmont had other ideas. For Turin, the escapades in Provence were a distraction. Instead, its priority was on the reconquest of its own territories, namely the Duchy of Savoy and the County of Nice. As such, while the Toulon campaign was ongoing literally next door, Piedmont Sardinia launched offensives in an effort to retake these domains. Now, to be fair to the Piedmontese, this wasn't completely crazy. I mean, it was nuts, but not completely nuts. You see, the French army of the Alps, located in Savoy, had recently been significantly weakened. In order to crush the Federalist revolts, the National Convention had redeployed troops from the frontier into the interior to besiege insurrectionary Lyon. Furthermore, immediately to the south of Savoy, the French army of Italy, stationed in Nice, had also been depleted. In response to the occupation of Toulon, some units had withdrawn to secure the town's eastern perimeter. So, given the internal disorders within France, the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia seized its chance. Besides, if the campaigns went well, then perhaps the Piedmontese could seize Grenoble, lift the siege at Lyon, and even assist the Allies in Toulon. But, despite Turin's chosen plan, there were alternatives. British diplomats, for example, tried to make the case that Piedmont Sardinia should instead focus on Toulon, shipping reinforcements in from northern Italy. This, the Brits argued, was a more advantageous opportunity than the simple reclamation of territories west of the Alps. Unfortunately for the British, their allies disagreed. Not only were the Piedmontese focused on their own priorities, but the Austrian officers advising them were also suspicious of the merits of assisting Toulon. Ultimately, efforts to reclaim Savoy and Nice failed miserably, but their consequences were still significant. With Turin's attention elsewhere, approximately 2,000 troops would be sent to Toulon by the end of the siege. This was better than no contribution at all, but it was still woefully insufficient for the embattled Allies. So, having covered the German and Mediterranean powers, that just leaves the British and some unexpected sources of support. The British we will cover next episode, because the ineptitude of London's response will be all the more appreciated once we're discussing the siege in detail. As for potential assistance from elsewhere, there were other options in play. Support from Switzerland, Malta, the Holy Roman Empire, and, most intriguingly, the French emigres were all possibilities. However, this would be a sizable digression, so for the episode extra for this episode, we'll be discussing this assortment of potential assistance. Assistance that either failed to materialize, was completely mismanaged, or even proactively discouraged. On that last point, the effort undertaken to ensure that the brothers of Louis XVI stayed out of Toulon is highly amusing and shows the complications of Britain's ill-defined war aims vis-à-vis restoring the French monarchy, and then Hood's rogue decision to occupy Toulon in the name of the French monarchy. So, all of this potential support and diplomatic drama will be the focus of the episode extra. A reminder that this and all the other great bonus content is available for those citizens doing their part to defend this podcast and keep great history on the air. So please do your bit and support the show today. Having established who would and would not be assisting in the defense of Toulon, it's now time to focus our attention back to that defense. In the last episode, we witnessed the opening stages of the Toulon campaign. Firstly, the occupation of the port by Allied forces in late August, and secondly, the French encirclement of the town by mid-September. This second stage had three critical ramifications. Firstly, in securing the strategically important village of Orlu to the west of Toulon, the French had significantly hampered Allied maneuverability. With French forces also arriving on the town's eastern flank and thus controlling the road towards Italy, the Allies were essentially trapped in a small piece of territory immediately surrounding the port. The ocean lay to the south, and Montferrand prevented any operations to the north. With the town now encircled, the campaign of Toulon was fast becoming a siege. Secondly, in securing Orlu, the French had seized a tremendous location from which to conduct offensive operations. From Orlu, the Republicans could press their numerical advantage in an attempt to seize key heights on the western side of Toulon's inner harbour. These positions would enable the French to threaten both the town itself as well as the fleets anchored below. Finally, during the skirmishes for control of Orlu, the French artillery captain Domata was critically wounded. Although he would survive, his incapacitation was a costly blow. Thankfully, through some combination of luck and destiny, Domata's demise provided the perfect opportunity for a young and enterprising officer to demonstrate his capabilities. Introducing Napoleon Bonaparte. Born in 1769 on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, Napoleon was 24 at the time of the Toulon campaign. The second son of a prominent Corsican family, Napoleon's father had been heavily connected to the movement for Corsican independence. Despite this, Napoleon moved to France at the age of 9, studying in schools and eventually the military academy of École Militaire. Talented in mathematics, he specialized in artillery, graduating in 1785. From there, it wasn't until 1793 that he saw his first combat. Now, surprisingly, this wasn't even with the French army. Since the Revolution, Napoleon had spent a considerable amount of time on leave, engrossing himself in the chaotic politics of Corsica. As an officer in the Corsican National Guard, he participated in the ill-fated expedition to La Maddalena in February 1793. La Maddalena is a small island off the northeast coast of Sardinia, with Sardinia being the target of a wider French effort. This, of course, being the same Sardinia which sits just below Corsica and which gave its name to the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia. The adventure proved disastrous, and Corsican politics soon turned equally troublesome. A passionate supporter of revolutionary France, Napoleon found himself in danger when local elites rebelled against the National Convention. To be clear, this revolt occurred prior to the purging of the Girondins, so it's unrelated to both that and the Vendée Rebellion. Forced to flee his homeland, Napoleon and his family narrowly escaped to France in mid-1793. Returning to the army, he was about to experience the most incredible stroke of luck. Conducting his assigned duties in the south, Napoleon crossed paths with a fellow Corsican, Antoine Christophe Salicetti. Salicetti was a member of the convention and was a representative on mission assisting with the siege of Toulon. An acquaintance of Napoleon's, Salicetti was impressed by his pro-Jacobin politics and his conduct in Corsica. In fact, Salicetti had originally been assigned to Corsica, and he too had fled the island. Although inexperienced, Napoleon had both the knowledge and the politics to be useful to the campaign. Consequently, the 24-year-old artilleryman was recommended by Salicetti to replace the injured Dommartin. For all his shortcomings, General Carteau was wise enough not to reject a representative on mission. Thus, in mid-September, an energetic, talented, yet untested Napoleon began the process of shaping the history of the world. Upon his arrival at Toulon in mid-September, it was immediately clear to Napoleon that the terrain was the key to French success. So, before we talk about French strategy, it is worth briefly discussing the terrain which was so critical to the siege. To do this, it would benefit you immensely if you opened your phone and looked at the maps I've placed in the show notes, on the website, and on social media. Alternatively, even just putting Toulon in Google Maps and seeing the natural shape of the harbours would be tremendously useful. If this was a history book, I would just insert a map here, but this is a podcast, so you'll need to self-help. It's here that I should note a special thank you to the members of the show, as it's with your support that I have commissioned custom maps for this episode. Maps which I intend to reuse in the future, so stay tuned for a special announcement. Now, as mentioned previously, Toulon has not one but two natural harbours. If we start with the smaller, this inner harbour was roughly the shape of a narrow oval, tilted slightly on about a 45-degree angle. At the top of the harbour, which is the northeast corner, you have the town of Toulon. At the opposite end, in the southwest corner, was the small settlement of La Seine. It was this settlement, and its surrounding heights, that the French had hoped to seize in late August, when Carteau's vanguard had first arrived from Marseille. On the eastern side of this narrow harbour, roughly halfway between the two towns, there was a small opening of water which connected the inner and outer harbours. Like the inner harbour, the outer harbour was also shaped like an oval, this time lying on its side, essentially running from west to east. The harbour was surrounded by land to the north and west, and a thin peninsula of Cape Sepet jutted out from the west to enclose the southwest section of the harbour. This is what gives the harbour its oval-like shape, and while I'm no nautical expert, I imagine that without this peninsula, you would just have a large bay, rather than a harbour. To the southeast lay the open ocean, and to the northwest, the outer harbour was connected to the inner harbour, with this narrow passage flanked by land on both sides. Again, looking at a map would be immensely beneficial. In addition to the two harbours, nature's other great feature was Montferrand. The town of Toulon was essentially wedged against the harbours by a series of heights. Ferrand was unrivaled in its prominence. Peaking at almost 600 metres, or 1900 feet above sea level, the mountain was deemed near impassable. I stress, near. Its prominent and northern position hampered communications between the French forces to the west and east of Toulon. Messengers could go around the mountain, but that was a time-consuming affair. Finally, although not a natural occurrence, Toulon's fortifications are worth discussing. Toulon, located in the top northeast corner of the inner harbour, was surrounded by a horseshoe-shaped ring of defensive positions. Perhaps most impressive was Fort La Malga to the town's east, guarding the road towards Italy and simultaneously the outer harbour. If one follows the ring of fortifications around Toulon in an anti-clockwise fashion, you'll see some established positions on the slopes of Montferrand before returning to the northern shore of the inner harbour immediately west of the town. Here, Fort Malbousquet lay to the town's west, and given the western advance of General Carteau, this would be an important position. Critically, as historically invasions had come from Italy to the east, Fort Malbousquet was not as well fortified as some of the eastern forts. Now, for the siege of 1793, there were two other fortifications just as important as Fort Malbousquet. However, these were quite some distance from Toulon's defensive ring. At the narrow stretch of water where the inner and outer harbours met, fortifications buttressed either side of the opening. On the western side, that is to say, near the town of La Seine and about as far away as possible from Toulon itself, you had the fortifications of Balaguer and L'Aiglette. Apologies for the dodgy French. These two forts, sitting behind a hill known as Mount Cairo, effectively controlled the entrance to the inner harbour. Forts Balaguer and L'Aiglette and the adjacent heights behind them will be crucial to our story. In addition to Fort Malbousquet, these western positions would be the focus of French assaults, and the loss of any would be fatal. Returning our attention to mid-September, Napoleon wasted no time in voicing his opinions. Up until now, General Carteau had hoped to storm the town with brute force. But Napoleon observed that the defenders had an acute vulnerability. Without the support of the combined fleets, Toulon was defenceless. Thus, Napoleon grasped that one didn't need to seize the town so much as the heights which surrounded the harbours. If one could secure the established forts, or even just create new artillery batteries, one could bombard the combined fleet. Facing a rain of cannonballs, the fleet would have no choice but to withdraw, dooming the defence of Toulon. Now, understandably, given Toulon's place in Napoleon's legacy, there is a tremendous amount of mythology surrounding his actions in this campaign. While there is no shortage of reasons to praise Napoleon's performance, I do want to dispel the idea that he was the only one to see the importance of securing the heights. Documentation shows that prior to Napoleon's arrival, multiple individuals, including civilians, had already identified the criticality of controlling the harbour. Furthermore, I would point out that Toulon's rebels had demonstrated as such when they threatened to blow the mutinous French sailors to pieces if they continued to obstruct the town's surrender to the British. So, Napoleon deserves much credit for the coming siege, but he wasn't seeing things that everyone else was missing. At least, not yet. But that begs the question. If Napoleon was seeing what was plainly evident, why weren't the French seizing the heights? Well, this comes down to a matter of opinion. If you recall, General Carteau was a former painter, owing his position more to his politics than military prowess. Napoleon scorned him as an ignorant amateur, and French historian Paul Cottard remarks that while Carteau wore a costume with brilliant majesty, he was hardly capable of anything else. It certainly seems that he wasn't capable of deploying effective artillery batteries, placing his limited guns in a wholly unsuitable position if one was to try to control the inner harbour. However, while there is no shortage of contemporaries and historians eager to sink the boot into Carteau, some are willing to defend him. Historian Robert Forczyk, for example, is at least willing to offer some sympathetic explanations. According to Forczyk, Carteau was sensitive to the fact that both his artillery commander and some regimental guns had been lost in the early skirmishes for Orlu. Furthermore, Carteau believed, not unreasonably, that the town's western defences were weak, and thus a prompt assault might be able to take the port through sheer force. Ill-equipped for a siege that might not occur, why should Carteau risk the limited artillery he had if it was unlikely to make a meaningful difference? History suggests Napoleon was on the money, but had the French taken Toulon earlier, which they almost did, then perhaps Carteau's legacy wouldn't be so ridiculed. Luckily for Napoleon, his credentials and his connections more than made up for his fast deteriorating relationship with Carteau. With the support of Deputy Salicetti, the young officer was officially designated the commander of Carteau's artillery on the 16th of September. Unusually, Napoleon's first problem was actually having artillery to command. You see, at Toulon, the French were woefully under-resourced. Cannons, gunpowder, horses, ammunition, they lacked everything. In this part of France, most of those resources were either deployed on the front lines or locked up in Toulon's arsenal, the arsenal now controlled by the Allies. So, what followed was a frantic treasure hunt. Wasting no time, Napoleon's men searched abandoned coastal batteries for anything of value. Guns and ammunition were hastily hauled back, and Napoleon put his new acquisitions to immediate use. Throughout the evening of the 17th, his troops worked in an exposed position to hurriedly assemble a new artillery battery. For clarity, a battery in this context is a grouping of artillery pieces. In building this battery, Napoleon's men had placed 5 guns behind a protective rampart made of dirt and stones. But, perhaps most notably, Napoleon broke with procedure when he refused to give the battery a numerical designation. Instead, he would give it a name, de la montagne, of the mountain. By the next morning, with construction still ongoing, Napoleon invited the representatives on mission, Salicetti and Ferron, to witness the opening action. As Jacobin deputies, and thus as deputies of the mountain, I'm sure they loved the name. The following bombardment was tremendously anticlimactic. Positioned to the far west of the inner harbour, only a fraction of the inner harbour was actually within range. Furthermore, with little ammunition to spare, each gun was silenced after just a few rounds. But operational effectiveness was not the point. In just 2 days, Napoleon had produced results. Replaceable at any moment, the inexperienced commander needed to prove his worth. In the hasty construction of the battery, and its resourceful armament, Napoleon had done precisely that. Now armed with both cannons and credibility, Napoleon would remain in command. On the next day, the 19th of September, Vice Admiral Hood decided to reply. Unfortunately for the Allies, the position of Napoleon's battery made this incredibly difficult. The reasons for this were multiple. Firstly, Allied ships simply struggled to get within range. At the mouth of the inner harbour, the depth of the ocean varied anywhere from 10 to 16 metres, or 33 to 52 feet. But at the western sections of the inner harbour, that depth reduced dramatically. At some points, it was as little as 2 to 3 metres, or 6 to 10 feet. Consequently, there was a real risk that larger vessels would run aground, transforming themselves from ships of the line into sitting ducks. As a result, the Allies had to deploy vessels with smaller hulls which could maneuver in shallower waters. And that is where they hit their second problem. These very vessels had been dispatched to complete other assignments. At no point were the combined fleets ever at full strength in Toulon. They were patrolling for enemy vessels, intercepting trade, transferring goods and personnel, etc., etc. To give a more concrete example, Captain Horatio Nelson would spend only 5 days at Toulon despite a campaign that lasted 16 weeks. So, the smaller vessels that would be useful, like frigates, were generally elsewhere, and thus Hood needed to get inventive. In an attempt to respond to the new battery, the Allies built floating pontoons, armed with cannon, to return fire on the French. In an effort to boost this rather flimsy rebuttal, a smaller French vessel was also pressed into service, with Hood reasoning that it was better to see French ships sunk than his own. Lastly, some larger vessels did try to engage the French, but these were limited by the shallowness of the inner harbour, and thus their effectiveness was hampered due to the distance of their targets. Furthermore, in addition to the water's depth and the availability of appropriate ships, the Allies encountered a third problem in their attempts to retaliate. The French had dug themselves into sandy and uneven ground, meaning that bombs often buried themselves harmlessly into the shore. This not only constrained the potency of the Allied response, but the variation in terrain also obfuscated French maneuverings. Thus, while the French could occasionally hit something, the Allies really struggled to do likewise. From the 18th of September onwards, we continue to see duels between ground batteries and a small subset of the Allied fleet. These skirmishes resulted in few casualties, but they were important nonetheless. Now, to understand why, it's worth remembering that this was the beginning of Napoleon's strategy, not the end. Although the position of his first battery meant that many vessels weren't in immediate danger, that didn't preclude the subsequent construction of better placed batteries. Critically, if the French could continue to build batteries on the western shore, they would eventually be able to control the western side of the inner harbour. From there, the French infantry could easily take the village of La Seyne in the southwest corner. With La Seyne secured, the Republicans would have a short stroll to the important heights of Mount Cairo nearby, as well as the crucial forts of Balaguer and L'Aiguillette. With these, the French would control the entrance to the inner harbour, and, by association, Toulon. So, despite lacking the ships to do so, the Allies needed to at least try to respond to Napoleon's new battery. Even if they were only facing the occasional poorly aimed shot, abandoning the western reaches of the inner harbour could have considerable consequences. Unfortunately for Hood, These consequences fast materialized. By the 20th of September, so just 4 days after his appointment, Napoleon had successfully constructed a second battery. This he named Sans-Culottes, and with it, he was doing far more than just scoring points politically. Built closer to shore and armed with superior guns, Allied vessels found themselves under increasing bombardment. The next day, on the 21st, French fire paired with unfavourable winds to force a withdrawal from the western corner of the inner harbour. Now was the time to strike. With Allied vessels driven from the shores near La Seine, a French assault could occur unchecked. This is what occurred, and La Seine fell to the French that day. However, La Seine was never the endgame. It was the nearby heights and the fortifications behind them which would secure Toulon. Here, the French had a chance to end the siege, and here they failed to seize it. Identifying the threat posed to the fleet, the Allies had responded with unprecedented haste. At 2 a.m. on the 21st, an Anglo-Spanish force had crossed the harbour and landed near Fort Balaguer. Knowing full well that the loss of Balaguer and La Galette meant certain defeat, the makeshift unit quickly seized the heights immediately behind the forts. Occupying what was both the high ground and a narrow stretch of land wedged between the two harbours, the Allies had taken a natural choke point. With their opponents located in this precarious but still advantageous position, how would the French respond? It's here that we get a situation which chess.com would rudely label a blunder. Distracted by inferior opportunities in Toulon's northern fortifications, Carteau failed to throw his enemy into the sea. Having taken the village of La Seine on the 21st, the French wasted time. Eventually, Carteau sent a small force to assault the enemy in the early evening of the 22nd. This decision has horrified the general's detractors ever since. At issue is both the size of the force and its timing. Firstly, keep in mind that in mid-September, the French had a sizable numerical advantage. In sending a force of perhaps as little as 400 men, the French were needlessly outnumbered. Secondly, in responding some 36 hours after the Allies had first landed, the French had carelessly given the enemy a critical advantage: time. As such, when they assaulted the heights, they found a numerically superior opponent who not only benefited from the high ground, but also rudimentary defences. These rough barricades had been hastily constructed with tree trunks while the French twiddled their thumbs. Now lacking men, daylight, and an advantageous position, it's perhaps not surprising that the French assault was an utter failure. But it's here that the failure became a farce. Compounding the initial setback, in subsequent days, the Allies occupied additional locations and quickly fortified their gains. In particular, the defenders speedily constructed considerable defences on Mount Cairo. Working with an energy that the French seemed to lack, the British hauled guns up the steep slopes and deployed them in entrenched positions. Consequently, Cairo was theirs. Over the course of just a few days, the hills guarding the crucial forts were transformed. Gone were the picturesque heights. In was one of the most important positions of the siege. Atop Mount Cairo, the British named their creation Fort Mulgrave. The French had a better name: Little Gibraltar. Losing their best chance to command the harbour, recriminations in the French camp were fierce. Representatives on mission, including Napoleon's friend Salicetti, were unrestrained in their criticisms. In one letter to the Committee of Public Safety, Salicetti accused Carteau of all sorts of incompetence and stated plainly that he was incapable of mastering the operations of a siege. Historians generally share similar views. French historian Paul Contard echoes Salicetti, both of whom fault Carteau for failing to renew the assault against Fort Mulgrave while it remained vulnerable. But perhaps the most fiery condemnation comes from Napoleon himself. Furious that his plan was being jeopardized by an incompetent painter, Napoleon detested the setback. For him, the consequences were clear. The enemy have seen the insufficiency of naval gunnery. They have risked everything, have made a successful landing, and there they are with cannon, a covered way, and palisades. They are going to receive considerable assistance, and we must make our minds for a siege. Indeed, a siege there would ultimately be. Having failed to seize the key western forts, and with the French batteries posing limited danger to the combined fleet, the quest for Toulon looked likely to drag on. But it's not the failures of Carteau on which I wish to end. Instead, it's the remarkable actions of his subordinate, Major General Lepope. Shortly after Carteau's setback, Lepope would try his own attempt to seize the high ground. He too would grasp defeat from the jaws of victory. As a reminder, General Carteau and his detachments from the Army of the Alps were positioned on the western flank of Toulon. On the eastern side of the town was Lepope and his soldiers from the Army of Italy. Once the necessity of coordination became apparent, representatives on mission had elevated Carteau into command of the entire siege, much to the annoyance of Lepope. Like Napoleon, Lepope resented Carteau, and throughout the campaign, Lepope routinely ignored his orders. Usually, insubordination was not good for one's career, but luckily for the rogue officer, Lepope was well connected. The former nobleman was the brother-in-law of the representative on mission Ferron. And yes, this is the same Ferron who we met alongside Barras during the escalation of Marseille's terror. At the end of September, both men were focused on Toulon, which was of course just to the east of the great Mediterranean city. Having seen the difficulties of taking the port by force, Lepope had also concluded that the heights were the key to French success. But, as Lepope was operating on the eastern side of the town, the commander naturally focused on different locations to his western comrades. Instead of the forts on the western shores of Toulon's inner harbour, Lepope fixated on Montferrand, the large mountain immediately north of Toulon. If the mountain could be captured, the French would have a fantastic position in which to bombard the defenders. In the early hours of the 1st of October, just more than a week after Carteau's setbacks at Mount Cairo, the French made their move. Although the Allies had thought the northern face of Ferron to be near unscalable, this was not quite the case. Like a scene from the ancient Battle of Thermopylae, the French used a narrow mountain trail to ascend the heights. Covered by both darkness and fog, it was ideal conditions for a surprise attack. And, surprised, the Allies were. The defenders knew of the trail, but thought it unusable for any serious operation. As such, only a small British picket of just 60 men had been stationed to guard the track. You can imagine their shock to spot the French advancing in their hundreds. Retreating to Fort Croix-Faron, the British soon received surprise number 2. The fort was empty. The Spanish garrison, which was meant to be occupying it, had also retreated. With the French experiencing no resistance, Major General Lapointe rushed another 1,000 men up the mountain, taking the French force to about 1,600. It's here, with command of the heights, that triumph somehow turned to tragedy. The mistakes were multiple. First and foremost, Lapointe failed to actually lead the men he was, well, leading. Instead, the commander rushed off to the representatives on mission to brag about his accomplishment. Having seized the mountain, surely he would replace that incompetent Carteau. Yet the chickens hadn't hatched. On the other side of Montferrand, the Allies hastily assembled a council of war. Realizing the vulnerability of the town should the mountain fall, it was determined that a counterattack was the only viable option. Thankfully for the defenders, reinforcements from both Piedmont Sardinia and Naples had arrived in previous days. With fresh troops to deploy, the Allies renewed the struggle in a daring three-pronged attack. From the west, south, and east, Allied columns scaled the heights. Seeing their advance, the French consolidated their force under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Victor, a future marshal of the Napoleonic Empire. What followed was a series of maneuvers praised by historians of various stripes. Despite the unfavorable terrain, the Allies pulled off a coordinated assault which historian James Holland Rose calls undeniably brilliant. In front of the French, the southern prong descended into a steep ravine in order to rush the enemy. Comprised of Spanish, Neapolitan, and Piedmontese troops, the assailants scrambled back up the slope to engage the French. While focused on their exposed enemy, the Republicans were then simultaneously attacked from the west by a mixed force of British and Piedmontese soldiers, led by Lord Mulgrave. French historian Paul Cottard claims that this assault was completed with precision, accomplished in spite of a hail of bullets and the treacherous landscape. Finally, the third prong of the Allied counterattack also navigated steep slopes to successfully assault the French from the east. Here, the British were joined by French royalists, and they threatened the rear of the Republicans, causing panic and disorder. What followed was a rout. As the French tried to descend in a frantic retreat, many misstepped. Men tumbled to their deaths, and the steep ravines soon filled with corpses. The defeat was absolute. In total, French losses were almost 25%. 75 were killed, 61 captured, and perhaps as many as 300 were wounded. In comparison, the Allies lost a mere 9 men, with another 69 injured. That's roughly a fifth of the casualties, despite the Allies being the aggressors on extremely unfavorable terrain. It is of little wonder why such an outcome is considered by some scholars to be undeniably brilliant. As such, it would take brilliance to defeat the Allies. It would take Napoleon Bonaparte. Thank you for listening to episode 72, The Siege of Toulon. In the next episode, we will see Napoleon's almighty triumph. You don't want to miss it. True revolutionaries already have early access to that episode and 3 fantastic episode extras. The episode extra for this episode is titled Unwanted Help, and it covers a range of potential assistance for the Allies at Toulon. Most intriguingly, we'll be getting into offers of aid from the French émigrés and the French princes. Offers the British were keen to reject. Of course, Grey History is only possible thanks to the amazing members of the community. If you're enjoying the revolution, then I need your help to keep this revolution on the air. For the price of just half a cup of coffee when main narrative episodes are released, you can make a meaningful difference to the survival of the show and support the creation of history that isn't black and white. To enjoy hours of bonus content, ad-free listening, and the warm fuzzy feelings that come with doing your part to keep a roof over my head and this podcast in your ears, please support the show today. There's links in the show notes and on the website. One final thank you to the newest members of the community, and a special thank you again to the heroes of the revolution: Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin, Scott, Howard, Fernando, Gilberto, and Ron. As always, thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day.